Well, welcome you on behalf of the Santa Cruz Emeriti Association and the Office of the Chancellor. And I want you to tune up your learning brains, juice up your cerebral cortex. This is going to be a lecture by Professor Dominic Massaro, Research Professor of Psychology and Computer Science. And he's known for fuzzy logical model of perception and animated talking head Baldy. Maybe he'll explain those along the way. He has a BA from UCLA, PhD in mathematical psychology from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, postdoc at San Diego, and taught for 10 years at the University of Wisconsin before coming to UC Santa Cruz, where he was the founding chair, among other things, among many other things, of digital arts and the new media. He has many fellowships and awards, including a Guggenheim, highly published professional articles and books, and I just take a note from his own realm and look to Wikipedia, you'll see it all there. His research focus is applying information processing to the study of language, perception, memory, computers, decision-making. And in this age of virtual teachers, internet access to enormous amounts of information, he's telling us that much analysis of this neglects the role of what you brought with you this evening, a learning brain. So for an analysis of the revolutionary age as it poses challenges to our educational institutions, our society as a whole, and to your learning brain, Professor Massaro.
So you see a little bit of technology here that we have to log on. Okay. Perfect. I did that on purpose. Well, thanks for the nice introduction, John, and to the organizing committee for inviting me, and to Rebecca Alvarez for organizing the lecture tonight. And and of course, my wife, Karen, for her unflappable support. But particularly, I want to thank the San Francisco Giants for ending the series in 5 games so that we won't be distracted here tonight. So let me give you a little roadmap about where I want to go. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Some of you already know too much, but we'll do the best we can. And then I'm going to just mention the economic crisis, and related to that is the cost of literacy and illiteracy. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about spoken and written language, and then I'm going to make a proposal that some of you might not like, and talk about how you might test that proposal and what some outcomes and spin-offs might be. So one of my branches of research involves the study of speech perception. I wasn't trained in speech perception, but I developed a theoretical approach to studying behavior, and I thought we should be able to apply it to language, and particularly to speech perception. At the time I entered the field, speech was considered to be a specialized process unique to humans with a huge innate component, that it didn't follow the laws of learning and other kinds of mechanisms that contribute to our other kinds of behavior. So it was very specialized. And I sort of had to take on the role as a maverick and disagree with that based on our research. And one area of inquiry that helped us demonstrate that speech wasn't so specialized was the role of visible speech. That speech perception is not just what comes in the ears, but it's a multi-sensory kind of process where you're utilizing many sources of information and the context that you're in and so on. So I'm going to show a lot of demos tonight, so I hope you have a good view. So here's a little one to show the value of the face. So you see, that's important. The face is important for the survival of our species. And then to do this research, rather than just dubbing videotapes, we wanted to present perceivers, both the face and the voice. We developed with Michael Cohen a computer-animated talking head, and we wanted it to be as realistic as possible because we wanted it to simulate actual faces. So, and he got dubbed Baldy by the kids that first used him, but I figured we better spell with his name with an I because he's from California. So here, Baldy will tell you a little bit about himself.
I'm Baldy, and I am proud. There is very little behind my attractive exterior. See, there is only a wireframe underneath. I live through computer animation and text-to-speech synthesis. My visible speech is accurate.
So that's Baldy, and what we can do is show how important a face is in perception. So Baldy's going to say a set of syllables like ga, va, ba, da, la, and so on. What you want to do is watch and listen and just keep track of which syllables he actually said.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so Baldy said 4 syllables, and if you were watching him, you should have perceived the syllable to be changing from syllable to syllable. But in fact, the syllable was always the auditory syllable ba, but Baldy's face was going ba, va, da, da. So this shows that if indeed your perception changed, then in fact the face was influencing what you perceived. So we can do that again, and you can either close your eyes and see that it's always a ba, or you can try to look at it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so based on this research, we developed a formal model of perception called the Fuzzy Logical Model of Perception, FLIMP, and it took into account that people perceive speech in the same way they perceive other events in the world, such as objects in space, and they use many sources of information. In this case, you see the information coming from the face and the voice, and I articulated this in several books, one of them called Perceiving Talking Faces. Given this model, we could actually predict that people can make sense out of nonsense. So what we did is devise a little sentence in which the sound is going to say, my bab pop me poo brive. The face is going to say, my gag cock me coo grive. Okay, so 2 sources of nonsense, and let's see if we can make sense out of it. My bab pop me poo brive.
Wow, we get my dad taught me to drive.
That's unbelievable. You're putting the 2 together, you can make sense of something that doesn't make sense otherwise.
Yeah.
So the reason why you perceive my dad taught me to drive is because both of those sources of information contribute something to that interpretation, and that's the best interpretation you arrive at. We always arrive at some interpretation. So after establishing this behavioral theory and having the technology of Baldy, our computer-animated talking head, we looked around for applications, and we thought that Baldy could be a good virtual tutor. He could be available 24/7. And we looked at deaf and hard of hearing kids because they're so dependent on the face, and we thought Baldy would be perfect. We developed him to have highly articulate speech, realistic speech like you and me. He might look like a cyber face, but his speech we showed to be as good as normal speech after many iterations. And so we settled on working with the kids at TMOS, Tucker Max Memorial School for the Deaf in Portland, and I'm just going to show you a little film here of the kids interacting with Baldy as a tutor, learning vocabulary.
To see just how fast Baldy can work, Primetime had teachers create several new vocabulary lessons for Timothy, words he had never spoken before.
Let's talk about what you see.
First, Baldy checks his knowledge.
Click on the bowling balls.
Then, Baldy shows Timothy each item correctly,
These are bowling balls.
followed by a drill of speaking the words for the very first time.
What is this?
On the ball.
It's not easy.
Click on the tennis rackets. No, that's not right.
Timothy
Right.
mispronounced and misidentified 9 out of 10 objects. But just 3 weeks later, we retested him.
Okay, Timothy, you're ready for the final test. What is this?
Soccer ball.
This time, he got 9 out of 10 correct. and his pronunciation improved dramatically.
What is this?
Baseball.
Okay, so we didn't accept just the primetime demonstration, but we did experiments to show that indeed the intervention of Baldy as a virtual tutor did contribute to the vocabulary learning of the kids. Then the autistic community got interested in it, and so we started working with kids with autism, some of them here at the Bay School and the other public schools in Santa Cruz and in other places. And so obviously, we had to make sure the teachers didn't write a script like, no, that's not right, okay? The deaf and hard of hearing kids, you know, they're unflappable. They'll do anything to learn language. Whereas with autistic kids, you have to have kid gloves. So we're going to see a little look at Tony, who's autistic. He can be very aggressive, but yet he likes working with Baldy. Baldy's very consistent. He doesn't surprise you. And in addition to learning vocabulary, Baldy can teach grammar. So in this particular case here, Tony's learning the difference between singular and plural.
Let's practice. Where's the ladybugs?
Ladybugs.
Correct. Where's the orange?
Orange.
You're right. Click on the oranges. Nice job, Tony. Where's the glass?
Glass.
So in this particular case, Tony just had to click on the objects, but he was actually saying them. So he was also, we were reinforcing his pronunciation. And so at this time, the virtual tutor was embedded in a very complex research environment. And we had lots of requests for this software. And so we developed a couple of applications commercially that could make them available to everybody. So we had a little bit of angel funding that we were able to create a couple applications that were user-friendly and ran on both PCs and Macs. And so we had Baldy morphed into Timo because they thought that was more commercially viable. And we had a vocabulary tutor and a lesson creator. So that's pretty much old history. Right now, Baldy is on the iPad in many different forms, and we have a little vocabulary lesson on the iPad that is the old standard matching game where you're trying to match two things, Baldy saying it and some image. So here we have Taryn playing with Baldy on the iPad. At that time, she was about 3 years old.
I found the song.
Wonderful.
You see, I found the song.
You did. That's great.
Doll.
So you can see that virtual teachers can be engaging, but there's some downsides to virtual teachers. The programs are expensive to write. Probably most people writing applications of this kind really don't recover their initial investment. They require maintenance, so you need tech support, and unless someone's around you, like I was around Taryn, you don't have any personal interaction. So this is just a downside to keep in mind for what's coming later. So now let's turn to the economic crisis. Karen keeps reminding me that I'm not an economist, but I'm as upset about the national debt as much as anyone else. And if you like statistics, you can go to the World Clock, and the World Clock tells you how things are moving. So here we can look at the national debt, and we can look at the number of spam emails, and what we can see is that our national debt is increasing more at a faster rate in dollars than the number of spam emails, if you could believe that. That's pretty discouraging. So we now enter this cost to society. We have the national debt, but we also have a cost due to illiteracy. Being non-literate in society does cost society money, and I estimated it based on some data about $250 billion. Okay, so illiteracy costs money, and of course, literacy costs money. We have to send our kids to school to learn how to read, and I came up with a number about $750 billion that might cost us to teach kids how to read. We have reading, writing, and arithmetic. Two of the R's make up our educational system. So what's the goal here tonight? The goal is a proposal where we could achieve universal literacy at a low cost. Well, let's take a little side road now and talk about, well, what's needed for universal speech? So to acquire speech, the child has to hear and do some kind of signal analysis, and she has to put those signals into categories. And in our speech, and speech of all spoken languages, syllables are very important things. So the child has to recognize these units as syllables and recombine them in appropriate ways. Now, what's not needed to acquire speech? Well, what's not needed is a theory of mind, that the child learning speech does not have to know that you have a mind that's different from her mind, and your mind's trying to talk to her mind. The child doesn't need to know any of that. As Car Talk, Click and Clack would say, it's unencumbered by the thought process. Speech is also multisensory, as we saw in our illusions with Baldy, and this multisensory experience occurs at a very early age. So here Andrew Meltzoff was able to get these infants to imitate him. And of course, this created a lot of controversy that infants could never do this because they can barely see and so on. But in fact, they can. And I've got a couple of demos here where the father and baby are looking into a mirror and seeing if the baby imitates. I turned the sound off because it had horrible background. Okay, here's another one where the doctor at a newborn, this is a newborn baby, the doctor is sticking out his tongue at the newborn baby. So it takes her a little time to get the idea, but he keeps sticking out his tongue, and then she does it. It's pretty amazing. This is a newborn. Okay, so as we said, Baldy speech is very accurate, as all of our speech. We communicate by the face, and we can do something like speech reading. That is to say, even without the sound, we can get some information from the face if it's not even complete information. So these are different mouth movements that sort of tell us about different categories of speech. And so here we have a case where somehow these rangers think that we're going to read their lips. And they're hiding their lips, and maybe that's part of the problem with that team. The discussion was lost in the telling there that Madeline and company are sort of hiding their lips. And you can even go to further extremes. If you're worried about what your spouse is doing, you can have someone video her at a distance and then get in an expert lip reader to read it. So here we have, in a Penelope Cruz movie, the expert lip reader telling her husband what she's saying just by reading her lips. And she's reading the lips of both people, of course, not to give you any ideas. Okay, so we've been talking about the face. Well, we can't forget gesture, right? I'm Italian, we speak with our hands and so on. So we need to think about gesture, what that means. And of course, there is a gesture language. It's a true language. It's called sign language. There are about 140 sign languages. One of them is American Sign Language. It's a true language. It has all the properties of language. And as you can see, it's gesture-based. And they also use the face to some extent. Now, given the popularity of sign language the last couple of decades, baby signs have become very popular. So lots of parents now are teaching their babies from birth baby signs so the babies can actually communicate by gesture before they communicate by voice.
This is my daughter Reese, and she just turned 1, and I want to show you some of the signs that she knows. Where's Dad? Dad. How about Mama? Where's Mommy? Mommy. Excellent. What's a sign for eat? Eat. How about more? More.
We know the deaf and hard of hearing have trouble in communication because they don't get the sound, but they do get information from the face. The face doesn't give you everything. So an engineer, Orrin Cornett, invented what was called cued speech. So his idea was that you could combine gestures with the face so that deaf and hard of hearing people could learn the gestures along with reading the lips and communicate exactly. And being an engineer, he came up with a very simple-minded thing that if the face gave you a subset of items, then the gesture gave you another subset, and they overlapped by just one item, then that had to be the item, the intersection of the two items, of the two subsets. And so here are some hand shapes. So they're using different hand shapes to disambiguate what's on the face. So for example, if we know when we close our lips, we have a labial sound. It could be B, P, or M. And then if I make this gesture, I know it's B, P, D, or G. Then the intersection, it must be a P. All right? Very, very simple idea. And we can see some cued speech here.
Don't you think you kids time?
So you see they're looking and watching both the face and the gestures. So this is an excellent idea, and in fact, they're particularly for the deaf community that doesn't want to have hearing aids or cochlear implants, they can communicate in cued speech. And there are summer schools where parents and family members go and they learn cued speech so that they can interact with their children. What we wanted to do was make it easier for that community because the person who knows cued speech is dependent on the speaker to also know cued speech. So what we wanted to do was intervene and present information to the perceiver rather in the form of gestures, rather in the form of little visual cues that would occur on a pair of eyeglasses. So this is a prototype here where you see the person looking at Marcus, and he's talking, and then these little LEDs light up that would tell what's being said using both information from the face and information from the cues. So is that clear? Okay. So, for example, again, rather than the gesture, if we have closed lips, and we have a red dot occurring, then we know that has to be a nasal sound, so it could be M. And if it's a white dot occurring in a different place, that's a fricative sound, and that would be a P. And if it's a blue sound, that would be a voice sound, that would be a B. And sure enough, what we did was we have two branches to this research. One is we have to demonstrate that people indeed can learn these cues. There's a learning component involved. So we first simulate the cues, and we have Baldy mouthing the cues. The cues occur on eyeglasses, and indeed, the kids can learn after several hours of learning to use the cues in combination with the face to recognize what's being said. The other branch of the research, of course, is the technology of analyzing the speech that's coming in real time so that we can present these cues. And so what we've done is we've developed a speech tracking system to pick up these cues, nasality, frication, and voicing, and the goal is to present these on the LEDs on eyeglasses. We're just now at the stage of doing something with the output, but I can at least demonstrate to you how the system works. So this is the neural net. It's sort of an automatic way of tracking speech. You want to pick off these characteristics of speech. So in this particular case here, we can see the difference between ice and mice is that you're going to get this red nasal cue at the beginning. So what we're seeing here is that the recognizer we have on our iPhone, okay, this is a very powerful computer. When we started working with Baldy, we needed a computer that took up a whole room and cost $100,000. Now everything can be done on this little computer right here. So this iPhone is analyzing the speech, and you'll see the dots occurring on the display. Ice, mice. Okay, so we can go back, you can try that again. So you see, ice doesn't have the nasal sound, it just goes from the voicing to the frication, whereas mice, you see the nasal at the beginning. So that allows the perceiver to distinguish ice from mice. We can try a few more, like slate versus slain. So again, in this case, we're going to have some frication, some voicing, and then we're going to have some nasality for slain, whereas for slate, we'll just have the frication. Slate, slain, came, cake. Okay, so this research is in progress now. So as I say, we're developing the technology to track the speech, and now we're developing the technology to take this information from the iPhone. It'll be sent to the eyeglasses with LEDs to present that information to the perceiver. So now when we have a deaf and hard of hearing person, and all of us are going to be hard of hearing if we're lucky enough, that is if we live long enough, particularly the men, we're losing our high frequencies, that if we know this, if we're wearing these glasses with the LEDs, we can do both the speech reading and using these cues in combination to recognize what's being said. Now, that's the idea, but one of the downsides is we still have to change behavior. That is to say, we have to convince people that it's worthwhile to learn this, and as you know, many people, they get their hearing aids, they throw them away, and in this particular case, they have to learn the cues, and more importantly, they have to learn the cues. So in this particular case here, this woman has hearing aids, and she can benefit by looking at the face, but she doesn't. She leans down thinking that if she puts her ear right next to what's being said, that's going to help her, but it doesn't. She'd be better off looking at the face and getting the sound in both ears. So we have this problem of changing behavior. So one little side road, and then we're just about ready for the proposal. Maybe you can anticipate it. We can look at disruptive technologies. So when print came along, people were very upset. Socrates was our straw man here, where he said that you would be a shallow thinker because now you don't have to memorize the culture, and that makes you less human. Memory is so important to being human that, in fact, print can't be a good thing. And McLuhan, many centuries later, reiterated that idea. But of course, Plato knew that writing is a good thing. It forces logic and rigorous thinking. And in our technological age, we know how important writing is, because you could never do a Google search on spoken language in the same way that you're able to do a Google search on written language. It would just be impossible. There's no way even Google could store and search all of that spoken language for you to have easy access to it. So writing is a good thing. So the current dogma is that speech is natural, it's acquired unintentionally, as we saw, whereas reading is artificial and it must be taught. And so what we want to do is challenge that dogma and see if we have another solution. And what we want to look to is brain development. The brain is showing this explosive development in the first 4 or 5 or 6 years of life. All of these new cells are growing and the connections are being made, and yet we're not really exploiting these. And we can look at the stages of brain development in infants, and we see that vision development is occurring just as quickly as speech development. So there's nothing really holding anybody back from learning how to read at an early age. And so this is more or less the hypothesis that we have these critical periods. Everybody recognizes that if you don't have auditory information early on, you're going to show deficits in hearing, analogously for vision. If you don't get the kind of language input you need early on, you're going to have deficits both in speech, sign language, and what we're proposing is reading, that we want to introduce reading at a very early age. So we can ask what's needed for literacy in the same way that we ask what's needed for spoken language. Well, for literacy, The infant needs to see things and do some kind of signal analysis and learn categories. So let's see how well the infant sees. So here we have an infant 2 weeks old, and what we're seeing here, how the infant is able to make eye movements to track objects.
Very clear, especially when we slow down the video. Notice how she looks at the toy but doesn't immediately follow it when it moves to her left. When she does, her eyes make discrete jumps. Here, here, and again here. A week later, we can still see the saccadic eye movements, but the jumps are smaller and faster. Research has shown that the movements are also more accurate and more able to anticipate the motion of an object.
So you see this huge development in just a week. So clearly the infant can track objects, and they can see much better than we might think they can. So that really by 6 or 8 months, they have the acuity that we have. So their acuity grows very quickly, and they can see the world as well as we can. And research has shown that infants at just 1 month can discriminate a square from a triangle. At 2 months, they can actually discriminate a square from a triangle when they're embedded in the same thing, like a circle, which is pretty sophisticated if you think about it. And other research has shown that infants can indeed learn and categorize objects, so that this research here shows that indeed infants can categorize objects in the same way that we might think of infants categorizing letters in reading, although no research has really been done with infants in that regard. Now here's a concept video that helps stimulate some of the ideas for my proposal, and this is farmer's goggles, okay? So the farmer here has on these intelligent glasses, and he goes out to the barn, and he can see what's up by seeing written information in virtual space superimposed on what he's looking at. So it's in Danish, but he can read Danish, so he's okay. And he can see where the barn needs fixing, what the cows are up to, and so on. Okay, so here's our proposal then, something very analogous, except we're adding the technology of recognizing the speech. So in this particular case here, the baby has on a pair of glasses, and on those glasses are processors, like they're going to be smaller than the iPhone, that can track the speech and have a virtual display, sometimes called a heads-up display with augmented reality, that will superimpose written language on the environment they're looking at. And basically, the child will see in written form what the caregiver is saying in spoken form. So, very simple proposal. So what do we need? Well, we need this technology of recognizing speech. All of you have probably played with speech recognizers at one stage or another. They're getting much more accurate and faster, because of course we want to synchronize the written language with the spoken language, and of course we have to get the nanotechnology to make it as small as possible. All right, so we have the heads-up display that is responsive to the speech recognition system, so that the child can see the written language superimposed on the world as the speech is being said. Well, our initial reaction is, hey, you're not going to get eyeglasses on my baby, those ugly things. But in fact, there are lots of eyeglasses out there that are reasonable, and kids will wear them. And so I think that's doable. So here's a little concept video, too, of Keegan interacting with his mom, Allison, where imagine Keegan's got glasses on, and then he's playing with his mom.
Can you get the rattle? I want this. We know you want it. There you go.
So you see that he sees the written language synced with the spoken language as he's playing with his mom.
You know you want it. There you go.
Okay, so that's the concept, and all of us may want to continue wearing these glasses because they can give us this important information. So that when this farmer comes home from work, he sees his wife, and she's immediately recognized by the intelligent eyeglasses, and it tells him, hey, your anniversary's coming up. You better do something about it. So they might be a good thing. Now, if you don't like glasses, people are working very hard to get everything on a contact lens. Okay, so once we get an energy source to it, it'll be a lot easier, and you'll just see the world through this contact lens and get this augmented reality. Now, if you don't like the concept of glasses at all, we can wire up a room. So in this particular case here, I guess Microsoft is releasing this system Connect for $150 that will supposedly recognize your voice and track your gestures. And so we can take that cue and say, wire up a room where we put on microphones up on the wall and a display on the wall, so that now when the child's interacting with the caregiver, what's being spoken will be displayed on the wall of the room. And one thing that, of course, is true is that our system is going to present written language for the kid's spoken language as well as the caregiver's spoken language. So when the child's babbling, we'll spell that out, so the child will quickly see the correspondence between the written language and the spoken language. So what's the feasibility of this proposal? So what we would need to do in true scientific form is have an experimental versus a control group, and of course you want this to be done in a double-blind study where neither the participants nor the experimenters know what condition you have. But in fact, you can't really do that because the parents are going to obviously know what condition their kid is in. But I think you could still implement a test like this and see if indeed infants can learn language at an early age. So what would be the cost of the implementation? Well, with 4 million new children each year, I think we can do this for less than $1,000 per child. So that would be less than 10% of the current expense of illiteracy and literacy in our society. So if the proposal is successful, then we're going to be facing a number of challenges as well as some serendipitous outcomes that are positive. So, much to our dismay, our adolescents and teens today have more hearing loss than their peers did 15 years ago. And we can blame it on the earbuds and so on, but the point of fact is that they have poorer hearing. Well, if these infants grew up with these eyeglasses, at least they would know how to read and they can continue doing chatting and so on. And another nice outcome, again, is worrying about the deaf child. 19 out of 20 children born deaf are born to hearing parents, and their parents want to hear them speak, and they want them to have English as a language. And so one thing you could do with our eyeglasses, although the child's not hearing the speech recognizer is hearing the speech and presenting it in written form. And there has been much work done that a good way to bootstrap a deaf child into spoken language is via written language. There's some wonderful anecdotes about how mothers dedicated to these children begin with the written language to bootstrap their kids into the spoken language. And it would be nice to have a love of reading so that we know that people don't read very much. And here's some statistics just from a few years ago where you see that people aren't really reading more than an hour a day until they're getting close to something like retirement age, so that you have an important time of life, 15 to 24 years, where they're only reading about 10 minutes a day. And so the problem is not only how little people are reading, it's what they're reading. So they did a study, and you have to believe this study because it was on the internet. They compared how much time people spent reading the newspaper versus reading a cereal box, and you could see that the cereal box wins like crazy. So what about schooling? It's hard to imagine, if we take reading away from the schools, what's left, and that's a challenge, and it's hard to envision that kind of thing happening. And we know our schools are in trouble. We know that charter schools are not the answer, and there is no answer. So this is something that we're facing. And so maybe we have to rethink the concept of schooling, and we can look to John Dewey, one of our favorite educators, who did not envision schools, but communities of people interested in learning a particular topic. And so this would be a real challenge to our society to think of these communities rather than schools. And we should be thinking about that anyhow, because in just a few years, every child is going to have an MLD, a mobile learning device, and that is going to be their source to knowledge. And they will not have to sit in classrooms and get their knowledge that way. They're going to have their personal device. There's already incredible anecdotes about parents talking about some possibility, and this 8-year-old is going into their internet access through their cell phone and telling them the answer, okay? Getting it from the internet. So we have to be prepared for that. So a final note is simply that what I'm simply asking is that we align our public spending more with our the brain growth. So here, if we look at brain growth, we see that 90% of it happens in the first 5 years of life. And the thesis is that that's when learning is possible. You know, we'd love to think of the idea that our brains are plastic and we can learn new things at any time. Those are good pep talks, but the reality is they're not so plastic. But these first 5 years of life, they're very plastic, and that's when you have to get to the child. And what I want to do is simply align the spending, public spending, with the brain growth, and that will maybe make society a better place. So what's the take-home message? One is, as I started out, we learned from our research that spoken language isn't special. It's just another domain that as cognitive organisms, we're able to use many sources of information to impose meaning on the world. Speech works just like other domains, recognizing a person in a crowd, recognizing how far away an object is, recognizing a piece of music, and so on. And written language does not have to be taught in some dedicated way of teaching, where didactic way where you have a formal way of teaching, but rather it can be learned seamlessly in the same way that spoken language is. What's required is simply that you start early when the brain is able to absorb all that. So what we're faced with, if this happens, is a disruptive technology, but as we learned from writing, when writing came along, these disruptive technologies can make the world a better place. So thank you. No, I haven't tried. So this is relatively new, which has been a spin-off of sort of the research that I described to you. And what I did was apply for a patent. I went through all the patents, and no one seems to have proposed this kind of technology in this specific application. So I have a provisional patent application. So that's why I can divulge it to you. So I have 1 year to make good on it, or just let it go by the wayside.
Do you see a downside to that much use of technology?
I don't know. I guess it all depends. You know, it's hard for us to accept new things, right? Whereas we see our kids accepting it so easily, you know. And just like, you know, once you start using it, like you probably see Sandy reading on the computer with no problem at all, but some of us still look and say, how could you ever read on the computer? And it reminds me of the caveman saying, I'll never give up that good old feel of stone. Okay. So.
As a grandfather of 3 new babies, my wife and I in the past couple of years have been observing rather closely the development, and many things you said today ring a bell. The question I really have for you is one, as you pointed out, the brain cells develop rather rapidly, but there are ages at which certain things are appropriate and others are not. So I'm not so sure about the written part of your thing, whether the brain has sufficient connections to be able to do all the things. I marvel at some of what your babies on the pictures do. I don't know how general that is. Are you talking about special cases, or is this? But anyway, it's really a question. When is it appropriate to move from verbal to written?
Well, it's not verbal to written. It's oral language to written language, and so that's the correspondence that I'm proposing. There's nothing special about each of them. It's simply that language is coming in 2 different modalities, and they're exactly analogous. And in the same way, I spent more time talking about how speech is multisensory. You could also make written language multisensory. So there's a lot of Montessori kinds of things of playing with letters and putting them together and so on, and tactile information and so on. So we can make written language multisensory in the same way. So I'm very confident. And in fact, not to steal my thunder, if you go on the internet and you go to YouTube, you'll see all kinds of demonstrations of parents teaching their kids to read. They have these cue cards, and the kid at 6 months is sitting there and recognizing written language. And it's these dedicated parents doing it. I'm proposing a way to do it in an automatic way. So I think there are proof of concepts that you can see where kids do learn written language. It's funny that I don't see too many of my developmental psychology colleagues here that, in fact, developmental psychologists haven't really looked, and I consulted several in doing this research of how people, you can see the kids, they take these nonsense objects, they can learn and categorize those, but no one's done it with print, which is really a very simple thing.
When you showed the picture of the baby following the object, I started to get a little anxious as a grandmother of little babies, because we haven't been doing that.
You haven't been neglecting your grandchild. Believe me, there's much going on in the world that they're following. Yeah, and this wasn't meant as a therapy. It was meant, or as a pedagogy. It was simply to show that the infants indeed can do this.
I realize that, but
okay.
Nevertheless, you have been intimidating me with. This is already a very competitive world for our children, and in fact, my pendulum has swung a little from being rather urging our kids to, learn early and do this and do that and hopefully be successful. I think, what is it all for? We should have them play in the mud. And so I have a lot of questions that come up with what you're saying. Aren't we pushing too much? Aren't we? I don't want to turn the clock back, but what are your feelings about that?
Well, I think these what's that? These aren't new questions, right? In terms of how to raise children, and I don't propose that I have a solution to that. I notice our wonderful mother next door, she's always prodding her child to say things and to ask questions. So, we came back from the Sierras the other day, and little Taryn got in the window and said, "Did you have any snow up there?" And her mother told her to say that. And I think that's a good thing. I think that engages the kids into language. And you could see doing that with our eyeglasses. So that it could actually cue the kid to say things or to ask questions about the environment and things like this. Or they could hear a word and the eyeglasses could say, what other words rhyme with that word, and so on. So I don't think it's too early to start at all. I think that, I'm not saying we should make super kids, but what I'm saying is that we don't have to wait till age 5 and worry about how well the child's doing in school. We can accomplish one of the things that's needed in life, and that is literacy, well before schooling begins. And then we can worry about more important things. Don, we can't ignore you. Okay.
Well, I want to invite you to try to speculate with me about some things. But first I want to say that I've spent a lot of time trying to help very bright college students and professionals, adults who have grown up and done well in the world, develop the confidence and increased ability in writing. They lack, many people lack enormous confidence. And when you ask people, tell me about yourself as a writer, when they do lack confidence, they often say, oh, I write just the way I talk, which of course isn't ever, or it's almost never true. But it is widely accepted as an explanation for why people in college, for instance, don't write well. They've been told that's the problem with their writing. I'm thinking that for about 5,000 years, writing has evolved into a highly conventionalized, and different places there are different things that are appropriate. What do you think the early connection in our lives between oral and written language through the lens that you've just described might do to that approach to those highly conventionalized forms of writing that people don't really understand that well. They often are led to want easy formulas that will work in all cases, in all contexts. Have you thought about
I haven't worried about that particular issue, although now that you mention it, there could be a very nice synergy between seeing the two modalities together so that the child could actually, the way she talks could be modified by what she sees written and vice versa. So there could be this synergy. I don't think we would lose any richness because the child was experiencing this complete correspondence between the two. And just let me say that just like there are no rules of language, okay, ain't is grammatically acceptable in Pittsburgh, and whether we like it or not, right? We don't dictate. If you've read Steve Pinker, he'll tell you, you don't dictate how language works. And similarly, I don't think we can set up these rules for written language. We see now these kids with their mobile devices and texting and so on. Written language just definitely has to change. What's language all about? It's about communication, right? And whatever achieves that. If you see some failure in communication because of this correspondence, then there'd be a reason to worry about it. But I can't really envision that there would be a failure in communication because of this correspondence between the spoken form and the written form. Sandy, didn't you have a question?
I just wondered if children have a variety of ability to learn. And some kids pick up some things really fast and other children are very slow to do that. Do you find using a paired modality, like using the dots on the glasses or combining the written and the spoken word, do you find that would help a child? Obviously it helps the deaf children. Does it help a child who can hear and see just fine, but propel them along a little faster than just if they were just left to play in the mud?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question directly, but I think, again, if we intervene when the brain is showing this rapid growth, I think we can be much more effective and see these individual differences diminish, where our current educational system actually expands the differences among kids. And the other thing is, I think we have to question some concepts that have been around the educational community for a long time. Like there's been this idea that people have learning strategies. Oh, he's a visual learner. Oh, he's an auditory learner. And I know this is going to go against a lot of what teachers think and so on. But in fact, there's been some very good research done in the last couple decades and show that there's just no evidence for that at all. That this kind of idea that there's a strategy and this child learns better under this strategy than another, that just doesn't hold up to empirical testing. And the other thing is, Herb Simon, the Nobel laureate in economics, said that it takes 5,000 hours to become an expert, and now people sort of upgraded that to 10,000. So it does take a lot of time on task to become an expert, and it takes that dedicated, focused practice to do that. So that's another thing we can't forget about. So that even though you learn to read and write, if you want to do something else, you're going to have that. But what I'm saying is if we intervene early, we don't need... I figured it up. In the first 5 years, if the child gets a couple hours a day of this interaction, that'll give them their 5,000 hours of written language. So then they'll be an expert in written language by the time they reach age 5 or 6. So I think people want some refreshments, so it'd be a good time to stop. So I appreciate you all coming, and I'll see you in the lobby.